Roth Summary of Max Weber's Economy and Society, Part 2, Weber's Vision of the Future and His Academic Politics. Weber did not hesitate to draw political lessons from academic studies, but the relationship must be properly understood. He believed that scholars should unflinchingly face the arduous work of fact-finding and only then express political views. He insisted on detachment in order to gain a hearing from his views, the basic strategy in his academic politics. Sociology became for him a weapon in the struggle against the predominant views in the Verein für Sozialpolitik and the founding of the German Sociological Association, a vehicle for the same purpose. The two great issues closely related were the social dynamics and future of German society and the feasibility and desirability of value neutrality in social science. In warning of the political dangers he foresaw, Weber used historical parallels, although he rejected the use of analogies for historical explanation. Thus, he appended one page of warnings to his 1908 study of the antiquity in order to impress his readers with vivid parallels, without implying any historical inevitability. Be upheld, at least didactically, the maxim, if it has before happened, it may happen again. At issue were the effects of bureaucratization. The paralysis of private economic initiative through bureaucracy is not limited to antiquity. Every bureaucracy, including ours, has the same tendency by virtue of its expansionism. In antiquity, the policies of the city-state paved the way for capitalism. Today, capitalism is the pacemaker for the bureaucratization of the economy. Let us imagine coal, iron, and mining products, metallurgy, distilleries, sugar, tobacco, matches. In short, all mass products that are already highly cartelized, taken over by state-owned or state-controlled enterprises. Let the crown domains, entailed estates, and state-controlled resettlement holdings, Rentengüter, proliferate, and let the Kenneth motion be passed and executed with all its consequences. Let all military and civilian needs of the state administration be met by state-operated workshops and cooperatives. Let shipping operations on inland waterways be compelled to use state tugs as partly realized in 1913. Put the merchant marine under state supervision, have all railroads, etc. nationalized, and perhaps subject cotton imports to international agreements. Let all these enterprises be managed in bureaucratic order, introduce state-supervised syndicates, and let the rest of the economy be regulated on the guild principle with innumerable certificates of competency, academic and otherwise. Let the citizenry in general be of the rentier paisible type. Then, under a militarist dynastic regime, the condition of the late Roman Empire will have been reached, albeit on a technologically more elaborate basis. After all, the German Bürger of today has retained scarcely more of his ancestors' qualities from the medieval town leagues than the Athenian and Caesar's time had preserved those of the fighters at Marathon. Order is the motto of the German Bürger. Even in most cases, if he calls himself a social democrat, it is very likely that the bureaucratization of society will one day subdue capitalism just as it did in antiquity. Then the anarchy of production will be replaced by the order which, in a very similar way, characterized by the late Roman Empire and, even more, the New Kingdom and the rule of the Ptolemies in Egypt. Let no one believe that the citizen's service in a barracked army, bureaucratically equipped, clothed, fed, drilled, and commanded, can provide a countervailing force to such bureaucratization, or, more generally, that modern conscription in dynastic states has any inner affinity with the spirit of the citizenry in arms of the distant past. However, these perspectives do not belong here. A note: Rentengüter were small holdings, indivisible and inalienable except with government permission, created for the inner colonization, Germanization of the eastern part of the Reich, first under the Prussian Resettlement Act of 1886. Count Kanitz, a conservative Reichstag deputy in 1894, demanded the institution of a state monopoly for grain imports in the interest of price supports for the output of the grain-producing Junker estates of eastern Germany. The so-called Kanitz motion failed, but was thereafter resubmitted year after year by the agrarian groups. It is, of course, significant that Weber added these perspectives in spite of his disclaimer. In the fall of 1909, the Weber brothers, Max and Alfred, clashed with an older generation of scholars at the Vienna meeting of the Verein für Sozialpolitik. Some younger members were critical of the state metaphysics of men like Gustav von Schumacher, and were ready to go beyond their elders in matters of social reform. Against them with regard to democratization, the two Webers attacked the belief of the older reform generation that strengthening the power of the state and extending the economic functions of its bureaucracy would lead to greater social harmony. Opposing the conservative state socialism of the aged Adolf Wagner, they pointed to the dangers of bureaucratization. Economy and society later demonstrated how the bureaucratic phenomenon could be studied comparatively in a non-ideological way, but at Vienna, Weber expressed his sentiments and convictions, which should be seen not only as the counterpoint, but as one of the motives for the sociology of domination. Weber granted to the older view of bureaucracy, perhaps in part as a tactical concession, that no machinery in the world functioned so precisely as this apparatus of men, and moreover so cheaply. With the Verein für Sozialpolitik, when the Verein für Sozialpolitik was founded in 1872, the generation of privy councillor Wagner called for more than purely technical yardsticks in economic affairs. At the time, this group was just as small as we would think differently are today in relation to you. Gentlemen, you then had to fight the salvo of applause for the purely technological accomplishments of industrial mechanization emanating from the laissez-faire doctrine. It appears to me that today you are in danger of providing such cheap applause to mechanical efficiency as an administrative and political criterion. Rational calculation reduces every worker to a cog in this bureaucratic machine, and seeing himself in this light, he will merely ask how to transform himself from a little into a somewhat bigger cog. An attitude you find, just as the Egyptian papyri, increasingly among our civil servants, and especially their successors, our students. The passion for bureaucratization at this meeting drives us to despair. Weber was not opposed to the Verein für Sozialpolitik, but as a propaganda association, as he called it, but its academic activities were unduly handicapped, he felt, by its ideological preoccupations. Hence, after the Vienna meeting, he proposed the founding of the German Sociological Association to be an instrument of collective empirical research and purely scientific discussions. In the winter of 1909 and 10, He suggested team projects on the press, voluntary associations, and the relationship of technology and culture. Weber apparently sustained most of the organizing effort. It was soon clear that his colleagues resisted project cooperation and only hesitantly accepted organizational responsibilities, and some men whose academic careers had suffered because of their novel sociological interests, Weber noted with chagrin, viewed the association as compensation for status deprivation. He spoke of a salon des refuses. The Sociological Association first met in the fall of 1910. Weber summarized the intent of the statutes. The association rejects, in principle indefinitely, all propaganda for action-oriented ideas from its midst. He immediately added that this had nothing to do with general nonpartisanship or the popular middle-of-the-road line. Rather, it meant studying what is, why something is the way it is, for what historical and social reasons. Secondly, the association should not be an assembly of notables for whom membership in one or another committee was a matter of honor. Thirdly, the association should not engage in empire building and arrogate to itself tasks better left to decentralized study. Sociology, then, was to be disciplined discourse and information gathering, but sociologists should be politically articulate. Weber wanted to separate the organizational setting for research from political action. In the fall of 1912, he attempted to organize men from the left wing of the Verein für Sozialpolitik. A few met in Leipzig to arrange periodic meetings on the failures and the future of welfare legislation and social reform. Differences of opinion, however, proved too great and no further meeting took place. At the second annual gathering of the German Sociological Association, Weber pleaded once more for the raison d'etre of the organization. Somber discussion and the study of questions of fact, since the habit of value judgment persisted, and he later said, "Will the gentleman, none of whom can manage to hold back his subjective valuations, all infinitely uninteresting to me, please stay with their kind? I am absolutely tired of appearing time and again as the Don Quixote of an allegedly unworkable approach and of provoking embarrassing scenes." This aggressive stand for detachment must be seen in the institutional context of the time. Weber especially abhorred the misuse of the rostrum for the indoctrination of the students, who could neither answer nor argue. The least tolerable of all prophecies is surely the professor's, with its highly personal tinge. However, many students indulged in the zoological nationalism. In that case, Weber's postulate involved the attempt to face them with inconvenient facts. Weber also continued Mommsen's struggle for a science without presuppositions, Mommsen's war cry against the repeated intrusion of religious criteria in academic appointments. Weber's advocacy of field and survey research, a crucial part of his notion of value-neutral fact-finding, put him ahead of most of his colleagues. But here he was also his own worst enemy. He was quite successful at raising funds and opening channels for the large-scale projects of the Sociological Association. Yet he was not well suited for the role of project or institute director who furthers research by diplomatically avoiding controversy with clients and colleagues. The press study did not materialize when Weber withdrew as director to avoid biasing the project. Early in 1911, he had begun a lawsuit to force a newspaper to reveal a slanderous source, a move that made him controversial in some press circles. Weber was never content to be a mere student of law. In the 90s, he had practiced law along with his teaching and writing. He considered the suit an honorable and pragmatic form of normative controlled struggle, one of his major scholarly concerns. His willfulness to fight openly and to sue if necessary in academic and personal affairs made him a highly inconvenient man, intended to impair his effectiveness as an organizer of academic enterprises. Weber persistently criticized the corporate failings of the professorial estate. His articles and statements on academic improprieties, the general state of the universities, and the need for university reform elicited the public counterattack at one time or another of groups of professors and officials of the ministries of education. In general, his intellectual, political, and moral demands were beyond the capacities of most of his colleagues. At any rate, in 1912, Weber withdrew completely from his executive duties in the Sociological Association. I must return now to my scientific work. Things can't go on this way. I am the only one to sacrifice personal, scholarly interests, yet I have achieved no more than the bare running of a coasting machine. The work to which he returned was economy and society. The planning of economy and society. Marianne Weber reminisced in her husband's biography that economy and society unintendedly grew into the major work of his life. The impetus came from Paul Seebeck, publisher of the famed Archive für Sozialwissenschaft und Sozialpolitik, which Weber, Werner, Sombart, and Edgar Jaffe had taken over in 1904. In 1909, Seebeck proposed to replace the outdated Handbuch der politischen Ökonomie, edited by Gustav Schoenberg in the 1880s, which among 24 contributions contains Schoenberg's theory of economic stages, and August Metzin's rationale for agrarian research from a liberal point of view. Weber agreed to edit an entirely new series. However, the fact that this was a new venture did not prevent an acrimonious academic row when a young professor who had failed to find contributors for a revised edition of the old handbook accused the publisher and, by implication, Weber of slighting the financial interests of Schoenberg's impoverished heirs. Weber came to Seebeck's defense. The young man, in turn, mobilized a group of older professionals and threatened a public scandal. In the ensuing morality play, Weber's acute sense of humor and propriety were once again engaged. The old handbook was limited to the traditional topics of political economy. Weber titled his series Outline of Social Economics, Grundrisse der Sozialökonomik. The term, wider than institutional economics and less inclusive than sociology, enabled him to encompass all relationships of economy and society. He asked a number of men for contributions to be completed within 2 years. However, some failed in their promises. Others produced disappointing manuscripts. Still others were dismayed as their contributions were outdated by the resulting delays. The first volumes did not appear until 1914. Then the war interrupted the venture. The series closed in 1930 with more than a dozen volumes published. Among contributors well known in the United States were Robert Michaels, Werner Sombart, Joseph Schumpeter, Emil Lederer, Karl Bucher, and Alfred Weber. Some titles in the series were The Economy and the Science of Economics, Economic Theory, Economy and Nature, Modern Capitalist Economy, Social Stratification Under Capitalism, Welfare Politics Under Capitalism, Foreign Trade and Trade Policies. There were also several volumes on primary, secondary, and tertiary industries. As the coordination troubles of the projected series mounted, Weber expanded his own contribution. Without this exigency, he might never have attempted a summa of his sociology. given his absorption in other interests and his conviction of the futility of the idea that it could be the goal of the cultural sciences, no matter how distant, to construct a closed system of concepts which can encompass and classify reality in some definitive manner and from which it can be deduced again. Now, however, he was motivated to attempt his own historically open systemization, since it was impossible to find a substitute for some promised but unwritten contributions. I concluded that I should write a rather comprehensive sociological treatise with a section on economy and society, to provide an equivalent presentation and to improve the quality of the series. I had to sacrifice other projects much more important to me. In other circumstances, I would never have taken on such a task. His wife saw these complaints. At last, he was under the spell of a great unified task. In his 1914 introduction to the series, Weber spelled out his rationale of the project. The basic idea was to study economic development, particularly as part of the general rationalization of life. In view of the systematic character of the work, the edition of a general economic history has not been planned for the time being. Tracing the historical lines of rationalization was certainly one of Weber's intentions in economy and society, as is also indicated by scattered remarks in the text. For example, below, page 333. However, the work is not primarily a study in the rationalization and the disenchantment of the world. In the letter of June 21, 1914, Weber explained to the redoubtable medievalist George van Bello his specifically sociological intention. This winter I will probably begin with the printing of a fairly voluminous contribution to the outline of socioeconomics. I am dealing with the structure of the political organizations in a comparative and systematic manner, at the risk of falling under the anathema dilettantes compare. We are absolutely in accord that history should establish what is specific to, say, the medieval city, but this is possible only if we first find what is missing in other cities, ancient, Chinese, Islamic, and so it is with everything else. It is the subsequent task of history to find a causal explanation for these specific traits. I cannot believe that ultimately you think otherwise. Some of your remarks speak more for than against my assumption. Sociology, as I understand it, can perform this very modest preparatory work. In this endeavor, it is unfortunately almost inevitable to give offense to the researcher who completely masters one broad field, since it is, after all, impossible to be a specialist in all areas. But this does not convince me of the scientific futility of such work. Even my hastily written essay on ancient agrarian history has been useful including those findings that have been superseded. This seems to me proven by the dissertation of Wilkins' pupils in Leipzig, but the essay was certainly no masterpiece. In the year 1914, Weber published a projected table of contents for the outline of social economics, including a detailed plan for the manuscript Part 2 he had written between 1910 and 1914. Part 1 was written years later. The table of contents shows that Section 3 of the outline was entitled Economy and Society and was to contain two parts: the evolution of systems and ideals in economic policy and social reform by Eugene von Filipovich, and the economy and the normative and de facto powers by Weber. Economy and Society is not then the original title of Weber's work. The title now used for Part 2 of the work is the true one, if more cumbersome in English: The Evolution of Systems and Ideals in Economic Policy and Social Reforms. However, its meaning is not obvious. Weber does not proceed from the national economy and its relation to society. Rather, he begins with social action, of which economic action is that rational case concerned with want satisfaction under conditions of resource scarcity and a limited number of possible actions. The basic economy is the household in the archaic English sense. In common German parlance, Wirtschaft may refer to a farm or an inn as well as to the national economy. The normative and de facto powers are the laws of conventions on the one hand and the groups that sustain them on the other. The relationship between the normative and the merely coercive, between legitimacy and force, is ever varying in the flux of ideal and material interests and the vicissitudes of power struggle. There are no historically effective ideas and ideals without social interest backing them, and force is rarely used without at least the semblance of a rationale before the staff and the subjects. The formulation of the title expresses these dual forces that impinge on the individual's social action. Weber's projected table of contents of Part 2 compares with the chapters of the English edition in parentheses as follows. 1. Categories of the various forms of social order, partly contained in chapters 1, sections 1 through 2, but mostly in On Some Categories of Interpretive Sociology. Appendix 1 below. The most general relationships between economy and law. The economic relationships of organized groups. 2. Household, oikos, and enterprise. 3. Neighborhood, kin group, and local community. 4. Ethnic group relations. 5. Religious groups, the class basis of the religions, complex religions, and economic orientation. 6. The market. 7. The political association, the social determinants of legal development, status groups, class, parties, the nation. 8. Domination, the three types of legitimate domination, political and hierarchic domination, non-legitimate domination, the typology of cities, the development of the modern state, the modern political parties. Weber died in 1920 before finishing either Part 2 or the latter Part 1. The last two sections of the modern state and the modern political parties remain unwritten. Weber's table of contents of Part 2 was not followed in the two editions undertaken by Marianne Weber and Melchior Pauli, 1922 and 1925, and the reprint of 1947, third edition. It was not until Johannes Winkelmann's edition of 1956, fourth edition, that the intended structure of the manuscript was largely restored. 10. The structure of economy and society. The following remarks are not intended to summarize economy and society, but to elucidate some of Weber's underlying reasoning, as well as some of the systematic connections among the chapters. Irrespective of their length, particular attention will be given to the previously untranslated chapters and sections and their relationship with other parts. Part 2, the earlier part. Chapter 1, the economy and social norms, on Stammler. Most books have a foil as well as a motto. They are written to criticize some books and emulate others. One visible starting point of economy and society is the attempt at a positive statement of what Rudolf Stammler should have meant, as Weber put it in the prefatory note in his essay on some categories of interpretive sociology. This essay was part of a longer methodological introduction to the work and corresponds to the first section in the 1914 outline, Categories of the Various Forms of Social Order. Like his friends Jelinek, Simmel, and Sombart, Weber wrote a critique of Stammler's economy and law according to the materialistic interpretation of history. Weber bluntly denied its right to scientific existence, but his critique was not identical with his objections to historical materialism. Stammler, a neo-Kantian philosopher, claimed to have systematically deduced the feasibility of objectively correct social action and laid a new epistemological foundation for social science by demonstrating the identity of social ideal and social law. He discussed at great length the relations between legal and economic order and denied their causal relationship in favor of their correspondence as form and content, a position diametrically opposed to Weber's, who repeated in Economy and Society that his critique was directed against A. the confusion of the normative with the empirical validity of an order, B. the confusion of regularities of action due to normative orientation with merely factual regularities. The contrast between convention and law in terms of free will, as if conventions were not coercive. And D, the identification of law and convention as the forms of conduct as against its substance. As a trained jurist and economist, Weber was faced with both the normative orientation of jurisprudence and the ethical components of laissez-faire and state socialist economics. He could develop a sociological approach only by insisting on the separation of the normative and the empirical, a separation accomplished with his theory of social action. In the essay on interpretive sociology and in part 2 of Economy and Society, he defined social action just as he did later in part 1. Subjectively meaningful action oriented to the behavior of others. It is called Gemeinschaft Handeln in the older part of the Soziales Handeln in the newer, and Soziales Handeln in the newer. Normatively regulated action is only one variant of social action. Sociology, insofar as it is concerned with law, deals not with the logically correct objective content of legal norms, but with action for which, among other considerations, the ideas of men about the meaning and validity of certain regulations may play a significant role as both determinants and resultants. Weber elaborated a continuous typology of social action along the line of increasing rational control, persistence, and legal compulsion. This typology, partly represented in Appendix 1, ranges from mere consensual action, an ad hoc agreement, through various kinds of regulated action and enduring association, to the organization and compulsory institution. These kinds of action differ from behavior that is not social or borderline, Massenhandeln, which may be rendered mass action, statistically frequent action, and collective behavior. Again, Weber elaborated a continuous typology of social action along the line of increasing rational control, persistence, and legal compulsion. This typology, partly presented in Appendix 1, ranges from mere consensual action, an ad hoc agreement, through various kinds of regulated action and enduring association, to the organization and compulsory institution. These kinds of action differ from behavior that is not social or borderline, Massenhandeln, which may be rendered mass action, to statistically frequent action or collective behavior. In this gross action as well. In this scheme, only men act, neither society nor individual groups. However, men acting in concert form groups, and these persist only if they have a constitution in the sociological sense, that is, if their order is consensually accepted by members or outsiders for whatever reasons. Belief in legitimacy need not be the primary reason. Therefore, Weber deals in the first chapter with the consequences of the factual impact of law on economic conduct. The economic order is made up of the actual control over goods and services insofar as it is consensually recognized. Sociological economics then deals with the actions of men insofar as they are conditioned by the necessity to take into account the facts of economic life. However, instrumentally rational action must also take into account the fact of law, defined empirically as guaranteed law. A legal order exists wherever an association is ready to enforce. Weber makes it immediately clear that law is by no means in all cases guaranteed by violence, and he rejects the view that a state exists only if the coercive means of the political community are superior to all other communities. The two basic categories of an order, convention and law, Weber defines in close proximity to Sumner and in contrast to Stamler. Although conventions are not safeguarded by men, a staff or apparatus specifically associated to uphold them, they can be enforced just as effectively as law by psychological and even physical coercion on the part of the group members. Compliance with a conventional or legal order is frequently determined by a person's self-interest in the continuation of consensual action. Unreflecting habit is another universal reason for regular and regulated behavior. The beginnings of convention and law in habit, usage, and custom lie in the realm of inaccessible prehistory. Yet, in view of these powers of persistence, the historian must be able to account for the innovating capacity of men. Rejecting older views of imitation, Weber prefers Hellpack's theory of innovation through inspiration and empathy, in anticipation of the theory of charisma in chapters 6 and 14. Again, Weber prefers Hellpack's theory of innovation through inspiration and empathy, and anticipation of the theory of charisma in chapters 6 and 14. Throughout his analysis, Weber combines his effort at terminological precision with an insistently realistic approach to human affairs. Men are creatures of habit, but they are also strongly motivated by their material and ideal interests to circumvent conventional and legal rules. In all societies, the economically powerful tend to have a strong influence on the enactment and interpretation of the law. However, the presence of law, with its various forms of coercion, makes a great deal of difference for social action. On a general level, more cannot be said. Here, as elsewhere, Weber carefully points out the limits of generalization. The extent of the law's factual impact on economic conduct cannot be determined generally, but must be calculated for each particular case. Chapter 2. On Marx, Michels, and Sombart. Weber's emphasis on the limits of generalization has here a critical thrust, directed against historical materialism and economic functionalism. Below, 341. A work on economy and society must sooner or later take a stand on historical materialism. Weber took his stand at the first appropriate moment. It would be wrong, however, to say that the critique of historical materialism occupies a dominant place in the work. Above and beyond Weber's other polemical and positive interests, what may appear at first sight as reaction to or reflection of historical materialism, such as Weber's interest in ancient capitalism, more often stands in a tradition of economic and legal history of which Marxism was an extreme offshoot. Weber recognized historical materialism as a political force, but did not take its ultimate claims seriously. About the time this chapter was written, he told his peers at the first meeting of the Sociological Association, "I would like to protest the statement by one of the speakers that some one factor, be it technology or economy, can be the ultimate or true cause of another. If we look at the causal lines, we see them run at one time from technical to economic and political matters, at another from political to religious and economic ones, etc. There is no resting point. In my opinion, the view of historical materialism frequently espoused that the economic is, in some sense, the ultimate point in the chain of causes, is completely finished as a scientific proposition." Weber also rejects economic functionalism insofar as it is postulated Weber also rejects functionalism insofar as it postulated an unambiguous interdependence of economic and non-economic elements. Not all social action is economically influenced. Not all groups are economically relevant. Culturally important groups, however, have some kind of relationship with economic results. All persistent groups must in some way meet their wants. Weber presented a simple typology of economically active groups, ranging from economic groups proper through various economically active groups and those merely influenced by economic factors, to regulatory groups of a political, religious, or other nature. In line with the reasoning in Chapter 1, regulatory groups belong into an economic typology of groups. Although Weber gave attention to the technological factor in history, he related want satisfaction primarily to modes of appropriation and expropriation, not to modes of production. The crucial importance of appropriation appears at first sight as a quasi-Marxist position, but in fact is another difference from Marx. Weber saw the Marxist concept of the mode of production blurring the technological and economic aspects. He explained before the Sociological Association, "To my knowledge, Marx has not defined technology. There are many things in Marx that not only appear contradictory, but actually are found contrary to fact if we undertake a thorough and pedantic analysis, as indeed we must." Among other things, there is an oft-quoted passage, "The hand mill results in feudalism, the steam mill in capitalism." That is a technological, not an economic construction, and as an assertion it is simply false. As we can clearly prove, the age of the hand mill, which extended up to modern times, had cultural superstructures of all conceivable kinds in all fields. Such superstructures are related to modes of appropriation, which emerge from competition for livelihood but also depend on the nature of an object, material or immaterial. Weber does not accept the historical generalization that free property and acquired rights grew out of the gradual appropriation by group members of their shares in groups' holdings. Private property became important with the disintegration of the old monopolist associations. It is a recurrent process in history that decreasing opportunities lead to monopolization. Then legally privileged groups with privileged members and organs come into being. Weber lists the stages of appropriation or opportunities through external and internal closure. With fine nominalist irony, he mixes contemporary examples from Imperial Germany with historically early illustrations. Once an organization has been established, the vested interests of the organs, functionaries, officials, tend to perpetuate or transform it beyond the original purpose. The phenomenon of institutionalization was a controversial point between Weber and his friend Robert Michels, who was just completing his Political Parties, 1911, whereas Michels reified his observation into the iron law of oligarchy and thus stressed the sameness of the phenomena at issue. Weber pointed to the multiple and often contradictory consequences of institutionalization which might lead to monopolization or expansionism. For Weber, the greatest historical example for the expansionist tendency was the age-old connection of capitalist interests with imperialism. The expansionist tendencies of an organization could, however, be restrained by monopolist interests. In voluntary organizations, the rational primary purpose might be overshadowed by communal goals if social action involved personal elements, thus promoting closure and establishing social legitimacy. Irrespective of this dualism, most rationally organized groups must satisfy their wants in one or more of the following ways: the ukos, market-oriented assessments, production for the market, mecenatic support, contributions, and services linked to positive and negative privileges. With this typology, Weber completes the economic framework for the substantive theme that runs through all economy and society, the preconditions and the rise of modern capitalism. Subsequently, this problem is treated from several vantage points: the household and other relative universal groups, religion, law, political community, and the various kinds of rulership. This underlying theme, however, does not determine the typological structure of the chapters. Moreover, it is paralleled by the themes of rationalization in religion, law, and politics, in view of the importance that Weber contributed to the political factor in his previous work. It is no surprise that his first historical explanation concerns the way in which the fiscal and monetary policies of modern states made possible the rise and persistence of capitalism. The issue of the origins of capitalism put economy and society besides the work that apparently was both inspiration and foil. Reuner subbarts modern capitalism. Its two massive volumes were published in 1902, shortly before Weber began writing the Protestant Ethic and Spirit of Capitalism. Sombart and Weber had been close allies since the mid-90s. Weber unsuccessfully tried to have Sombart succeed him in Freiburg when he left for Heidelberg in 1897 in the reactionary 90s, and the so-called Era Sturm. Official resistance to Sombart was too strong. Both men shared a wide interest in the capitalist enterprise, the spirit of capitalism, social reform, and the labor movement, and together they advocated the value-neutral approach in Archive für Sozialwissenschaft. Sombart was the more flamboyant of the two and proved to be more mercurial. On the one hand, he demanded facts. This admonition rang in my ears all the time I was writing the book. On the other, he also tried to explain them from ultimate causes. What separates me from Schmuller and his school is the constructive element in the ordering of the material, the radical postulate of a uniform explanation from last causes, the reconstruction of all historical phenomena as a social system, in short, what I call the specifically theoretical. I also might say Karl Marx. This was not much more than a rhetorical declaration exaggerating the difference from his former teacher Schmuller. The work failed to link the many facts with its postulate and showed that Sombart was already far removed from Marxism, if he ever was an orthodox Marxist. At any rate, Weber did not consider the postulate feasible, but he was interested in Sombart's facts and decided to approach them through systematic comparative study. Since this involved a methodological difference, it was more than a mere sensible division of labors. Sombart contrasted the traditionalist orientation of craft production with the spirit of capitalism, which to both men appeared very different from the universal desire for wealth. This spirit was a peculiarly European phenomenon, but Sombart barely hinted at the comparative perspective. A glance at other major civilizations such as the Chinese, Indian, or ancient American is enough to prove, in this regard too, the insufficiency of the view that the genesis of modern capitalism can be explained from a general law of development of the human economy. Where Sombart merely glanced, Weber proceeded to the comparisons of economy and society, and immediately afterwards the studies of China, India, and ancient Judaism. Chapters 3 through 4. The relatively universal groups. At the beginning of Chapter 3, Weber limits his use of the term society to the general kinds of human groups. He intends to deal with economy and society in this sense, not with economy and Kultur, literature, art, science. The first group to be treated as are relatively universal: household, neighborhood, kin group, ethnic group, religious group, political community. In other words, they are found at various levels of historical development. The developmental forms of these groups are taken up in the sociology of domination. The treatment of more basic forms in intentionally brief. The treatment of the more basic forms is intentionally brief, in part because Weber is primarily interested in more differentiated associations of their relationship to religion, law, and politics, in part presumably because Marianne Weber had dealt with some of the subject matter at length in her work on Wife and Mother in Legal Development, 1907. Weber limits himself to a series of points that either have polemical value or prepare the later exposition. His critical targets are evolutionary conceptions, especially the theory of matriarchy and the related socialist theory of family, property and the state, Engels and Bebel. The neighborhood sentimentalism of agrarian romantics, Goethe's notion of the kin group as the first political association, and racist and nationalist ideas, against the romanticist notion of those mourning the passing of community, but also against the apostles of progress. Weber endeavors to show the communal and rationalist, capitalist and communist, traditionalist and modernist elements appear in ever new combinations. In short, that history is not the progression from Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft. Positively, Weber points out the household is the original locus of patriarchal rulership and the capitalist enterprise. The neighborhood is an unsentimental economic brotherhood. The kin group is the protective counterforce to the authoritarian household. Ethnic groups are not groups, merely speaking, but propensities for or residues of group formation. Weber particularly stresses the pluralism of group affiliation in relatively undeveloped societies before the emergent political community gradually monopolizes the use of force, contrary to the view that modern society is more pluralistic than traditionalist society in this respect. Weber sees no evidence for a universal stage of matriarchy. He explains maternal groupings as a result of military separation of males from the household. This separation produces the men's house, which nowadays appears in residual form in army barracks and student dormitories. Weber likes to move back and forth, often with ironic undertones between the ancient origin of a phenomenon and its survival into modern times. The patriarchal household emerges with the military dispersion of warriors in the countryside. In dealing with polygamy and monogamy, Weber provides a specifically economic, non-romantic explanation. Monogamy suited the household of the emergent urban patriciate. Only later did Christianity raise it to an ethical level. With the dowry, the calculative spirit entered the domestic communism of the family. This spirit reached a high point with the rise of the capitalist family enterprise. The legal forms of early modern capitalism originated in part in the communistic household, as Weber had already shown in his dissertation. The enterprise was evidently separated from the household, but Weber points to an historical twist. A later economic stage, such as capitalism, may perpetuate or recreate an earlier communistic family structure in which the extended family remains a unit. Beyond the balance sheet, those lucky enough to participate enter the realm of equality and brotherhood, a reference to the communist slogan. Here, Weber takes obvious pleasure in outdoing the dialectic of historical materialism. His general point is that the household and domestic authority are relatively independent of economic conditions. In fact, they often shape economic relationships because of their historically developed structure. Weber believed that the contractual regulation of household relations was a peculiarly Occidental phenomenon. Only in Europe did the household create out of itself the capitalist enterprise. Elsewhere it developed into oikos, the economic basis of patrimony domination. Households are related to one another through neighborliness in an unpathetic economic sense. The neighborhood is the typical helper in need. Thus, neighborliness is not restricted to social equals, but customary help rendered by social inferiors may gradually turn into manorial service. The neighborhood may become an economic group proper or an economically regulatory group, but even in the self-sufficient economy of early times, there is no necessary identity between neighborhood and other associations. Only in the case of joint political action can the neighborhood develop into a local community. The kin group is usually not an extension of the household, but a protective group guaranteeing the security and legal protection of the individual. Collective self-help is the most typical means for the defense of its interests. The oldest trial procedures originate in compulsory arbitration within and between kin groups. Insofar as kin groups do not have a head with powers of command and a staff, they are not organizations in Weber's sense. Through their regulation of marriage and lineage relations, kin groups may effectively curb domestic authority. Similarly, the property laws of great empires steadily weaken unlimited patriarchal power. But because of this very predominance of patriarchalism, another dialectic feature of historical development, kin groups may oppose political associations and cross the boundaries of political communities. They tend to become associations only when economic conditions make it desirable to erect monopolies against outsiders. Race and ethnicity are familiar devices for monopolistic protection of interests. Weber doubts the sociological utility of both concepts if understood in a naturalistic way. He insists that regardless of the outcome of genetic research, social behavior must be interpreted primarily in social terms. Ethnic membership derives from some consciousness of kind due to common customs, common language, and common historical experiences. It may be the product of political association and may remain after the group has dissolved politically. The cultural and political importance of ethnicity rests on the fact that the sense of ethnic honor is a specific honor of the masses, and in the extreme leads to the notion of the chosen people. Weber's sketch of nationality and cultural prestige illuminates the political situation of Central Europe before the First World War. The section is closely linked to the chapter on the political communities. However, Weber had one more major universal group to deal with, the religious Gemeinschaft. In theoretical complexity, originality, and sheer size, the chapter on religious groups was bound to transcend the preceding chapters. Chapter 6, The Sociology of Religion. In 1902, Sombart touched on the impact of Calvinism and Quakerism on capitalist development and noted that it was too well known a fact to require detailed explanation. Weber, far from being deterred by this dismissal, proceeded to state more fully the case for the Protestant Ethic's impact on the spirit of capitalism. He may also have been prompted by Schmuller, who in a masterful review of Sombart, his most exasperating pupil, observed, "Whatever Marx and the Social Democrats have against the capitalists, the hunger for profit and the untrammeled ruthlessness toward the workers' welfare concerns primarily the manner in which the individualist drive for acquisition developed between 1500 and 1900 and cut itself loose from most earlier moral and social restraints. The phenomena must be investigated if one wants to understand today's economy." If it is unclear whether Schmuller's suggestion really was a major factor in Weber's decision to write the Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, it can be stated affirmatively that the relationship between Calvinism and capitalism had been an internal academic issue for some time, and that Weber wrote in response to other studies, and not just against historical materialism as has sometimes been suggested, in spite of his own denial at the end of the work. Weber acknowledged particularly the earlier work of three colleagues, Eberhard Gotten's monumental study modestly entitled Economic History of the Black Forest, Werner Wittge's tremendously perceptive remarks on religious differences between France and Germany, and George Jelenich's proof of religious traces in the genesis of the rights of men, which gave me a crucial stimulus to investigate the impact of religion in areas where one might not otherwise look. The publication of the two essays on the Protestant Ethic in the Archive für Sozialwissenschaft in 1904-5 was an instantaneous literary success and almost immediately led to the controversy that has since continued unabated. The exchange of critiques and anti-critiques between Weber and his adversaries lasted until 1910. Weber considered the exchanges pretty unrewarding and decided on another positive statement which became the present chapter. He left the historical treatment of Protestantism to his friend Ernest Trotsky, who was then working on the social teachings of the Christian churches and sects, and instead put the theme in a comparative perspective. Yet neither the underlying issue of the rise of capitalism nor that of rationalization and secularization over the ages determines the structure of the sociology of religion. It is built, rather, around the relation of religions to their organizational carriers, functionaries to the status groups and classes supporting them, into their inherent theological elaboration. Weber took the general function of religion, whether in a Durkheimian or Marxist sense, for granted. With his customary realism, he stressed the compensatory functions of religion, and even more the political use of religion for legitimation and pacification. In a limited way, it is possible to see his sociology of religion as a vast paraphrase of Marx's dictum that religion is the sigh of a creature in distress, the heart of a heartless world, the spirit of times without spirit. It is the opiate of the peoples, but there is an important difference. Weber had a much more profound sense than Marx for the meaning of ethical conduct. The religious polemics of Engels, August Bebel, and Karl Kautsky appeared to him as shallow rationalism. Possibly, Weber was familiar with Engels' fleeting remarks on Calvinism. Where Luther failed, Calvin triumphed. His dogma was adapted to the most daring of the bourgeois. His doctrine of predestination was the religious expression of the fact that in the commercial world of competition, success or bankruptcy depend not on the enterprise or skill or the individual, but on circumstances independent of him. At any rate, the Protestant ethic and spirit of capitalism reversed this materialistic interpretation without substituting a mere spiritualist one. Behind the divergent perspectives of Weber and the Marxists was a personal difference. The Marxists were psychologically unable to take religion seriously enough to undertake his kind of study. Weber called himself unmusical and mattress religious. This gave him the necessary analytical distance. But he lived in an extended family in which the women were devout and articulate believers. With his strong family sense, Weber could have disdained the religion only at the price of offending those closest to him. This gave him the requisite empathy for the study of religion. For systematic reasons, Chapter 6 begins with a brief treatment of primitive religion and the original this-worldly orientation of magical and religious actions. Weber quickly sketches the rise of functional, local, and finally universalist and monotheist conceptions of deity. As in the preceding chapters, his ethnographic examples are occasionally doubtful or erroneous, or a statement may suffer from the telescoping of historical events over millennia, or the love of paradox carries him to an extreme. When he comes to the rationalization of conduct through ethical and exemplary prophecy, Weber strikes out on his own. Building on Harnack's typology, he isolates the features peculiar to the prophet through a comparison with magicians, lawgivers, teachers of ethics, and mystagogues. Prophets and priests organize the Prophets and priests organized a permanent association of laymen, the congregation. Prophets developed preaching and pastoral care, priests the dogmata and the canonical writings. After thus dealing with the religious leaders and the associations created by them, Weber turns to an examination of all major social strata and their affinity to religion. This provides a comparative frame for assessing the Puritan bourgeoisie, but in the context of the present work, it also prepares a treatment of aristocratic and bureaucratic rulership, the role of the intelligentsia, and the themes of bureaucratization and democratization. Aristocrats tend toward irreligion, unless they are warriors for the faith, an historically important but transitional phenomenon. Bureaucrats are inclined toward a formalistic religion or philosophy, while permitting less complex magical beliefs among the masses for the sake of mass domestication. The urban bourgeoisie, even though concerned with economic rationality, tends to be more religious than the aristocrat and bureaucrat. In fact, the rationalist piety of bourgeois believers is a step on the road that ultimately led to the Protestant ethic. Non-privileged strata have powerful needs for salvation, but they may find primarily passive or purely affective expression. Weber goes down the social ladder from the craftsman's piety, so important in early Christianity, to the religious disinclination of slaves, day laborers, and the modern proletariat. Peasants are traditionally concerned not with salvation, but with the practical, magical effects of religion. Even though in modern times the rural population is a mainstay of Christian conservatism, salvation religions, usually the creation of intellectuals of higher social ranks, can dissolve into the creed of non-privileged strata, changing their function from legitimation to compensation. Pariah peoples tend to develop an intense religious attachment, Judaism being the historically decisive case. After this tour de force in the sociology of knowledge, Weber balances his analysis of status tendencies with an investigation of religious intellectualism. Intellectuals of diverse status elaborate religions on logical and theological grounds. Status differences may recede in the face of changing political fortunes. An important case is the escapism of intellectuals of politically declining strata or defeated communities. Conversely, nativist lower-class intellectuals may turn against the intellectualism of higher strata, as it happened in Judaism and early Christianity vis-à-vis Hellenized intellectuals. Weber carries his analysis up to his own time, ending with secular salvation ideologies and some biting remarks on cafe house intellectuals. The last part examines the influences of religious ethics on the world, the sphere of the economic, political, artistic, and sexual. The last extant section breaks off with yet another attempt to contrast Jewish rationalism, Puritan asceticism, Islamic thisworldliness, Buddhist otherworldliness, and Jesus' indifference to the world, all with a look back toward Protestant ethic, but also in anticipation of the subsequent large-scale studies of the great world religions, to which Weber turned without completing Part 2 of Economy and Society. Chapter 7, The Market, Its Impersonality and Ethic. The chapter on market, another group, Gemeinschaft, in Weber's terminology, logically follows the treatment of religion. The economically rationalized, hence ethically rational, character of peer market relationships is basically irreconcilable with ethical religion. with the historic exception of Calvinism. Whereas Weber gave much attention to the chapter on religion, his market chapter is only a brief sketch. Unlike the sociology of religion, the market was a topic that could be handled by many other men. Perhaps Weber postponed writing the chapter because he waited for other contributions to the series, the better to coordinate the various expositions. In any case, the fragment he did write was sufficient to distinguish the market from more natural groups and the political community. The market is the Gemeinschaft based on the most rational kind of social action, association through exchange. The association may last only for the duration of the exchange, or it may develop into a continuous relationship. In early history, the market was the only peaceful relationship of men who were not linked through the household, kinship, or tribal ties. The participants were strangers, enemies, who did not expect action in accordance with an ethic of brotherhood. The community of the market is the most impersonal group, but not because it involves struggle, Kampf, between opposed interests. There is struggle also in the most intimate relationships. Rather, the market is the more impersonal. The more the struggle of the participants is oriented merely to actual or potential exchanges. In this manner, the market is the exact opposite of any association based on a former order, voluntary or imposed. Even so, neither the use of money nor the impersonality of exchange prevent the eventual rise of a market ethic binding on those who continually trade. Such exchange partners develop expectations of reciprocity which make them abide by the rules. Occasional traders are most likely to ignore the maxim that honesty is the best policy. Weber sarcastically cites aristocratic cavalry officers trading horses. A familiar current example is the private sale of automobiles. One aspect of the market ethic is the fixed price, a peculiarly European phenomenon that became one of the preconditions of modern capitalism. The market proved destructive to many status monopolies of the past, yet the very success of capitalist interests on the free market led to new monopolies based either on political alliances or sheer superiority over competitors. As markets increased in importance, religious and political associations moved to protect them for reasons of their own. As markets increased in importance, religious and political associations moved to protect them for reasons of their own. This brings Weber to the organizations concerned with legal regulation. The Sociology of Law. Chapter 8, The Sociology of Law. The sociology of law gives historical depth to the introductory statement or convention and law, Chapter 1. After the earlier methodological critique of Stamler's approach, Weber now demonstrates what a sociology of law should be, in contrast to legal philosophy, jurisprudence, and mere legal history. The chapter provides a typological setting within which a given legal phenomenon can be located, not with regard to any systematically or dogmatically proper placement, but for the sake of historical explanation. The impact of Roman law and common law on the rise of capitalism constitutes one link with the overall theme of economy and society. Another is the varieties of rationalization which may be mutually incompatible. The chapter is also constructed with a view to the frequently mentioned sociology of domination. Here Weber treats the creation and administration of law by political and other associations. There the ruler's legitimation, organizational power, and motives for imposing law. If Weber was a self-made scholar in affairs religious, he was on academic home ground in the sociology of law. Not only do legal topics of his dissertation and habilitation of 2 decades before appear, but so does much of the latter literature. Even as Weber broadened his intellectual concerns, he retained an active interest in legal studies. His ability to write the sociology of law as a legal historian makes this the most difficult chapter for the legal layman and mere sociologist, for whom it may be helpful to perceive the broader structural parallels with the sociology of religion. The substitution of legal for religious topics yields the following rough outline: the basic categories of public and private law, the development of contracts and juristic personality, early forms of law administered by non-political associations, and occupational typology of specialists ranging from charismatic law prophets to legal honorariaries and university-trained judges, a typology of various forms of legal training, the historical system of theocratic and secular law, a comparison of Indian, Islamic, Persian, Jewish, canon, and Roman law, the great codifications, the revolutionary power of natural law, formal and substantive rationalization, and irreducible and irredacable tension between formal and substantive justice. Finally, the irrationalist trends at the eve of the First World War and their characteristic reaction to formal rationality and the dominance of legal experts, paralleling the fashion of surrogate religions in intellectual circles and the romantic game of syndicalism. Here, Weber continues the sociology of intellectuals with an examination of their propensity for substantive justice on the one hand, the skepticism on the other. He points to another historical dialectic. 19th century socialist intellectuals first advanced substantive natural law against the formalist natural law of the bourgeoisie and then undermined their own position through positivistic relativism and Marxist evolutionism. The gradual ascendancy of state law over the law of other groups is part of the larger theme of the rise of the political community. Weber follows juridical usage when he makes the existence of a legal order dependent on a staff ready to resort to physical or psychic coercion, and when he defines the modern political community, the state, in terms of its monopoly on the legal use of force. As a sociologist, however, he is equally concerned with the extent to which this claim is de facto limited in the modern state. Where conventional and religious sanctions continue to be powerful, Weber remembered as one of his youthful lessons the inability of the mighty Prussian state to triumph over the Catholic Church in the Kulturkampf of the 1870s and again over the Social Democrats in the 80s, the period of the anti-socialist laws. The chapter on political communities links the chapters on the more universal groups and the sociology of law with the sociology of domination. It describes the development of political community from rudimentary beginnings to complex differentiation. For many centuries, the political community differed only quantitatively from the other relatively universal groups that gradually lost their protective and coercive functions as the old political pluralism declined. Eventually, a qualitative difference developed, a belief in the right of the state to define the legal order and the use of legitimate force. This belief in legitimacy resulted from gradual usurpation. Previously, the notion of legitimate force was part of the consensual action of kin members engaging in blood revenge. Now it became part of the organized action of community members. In the modern state, the exercise of political power is part of institutional action. The political community is a group ready to defend a given territory with force against outsiders. This minimum definition is designed to encompass all historical communities and thus does not even include the guarantee of internal security. Many communities actually did limit themselves to nothing more than the maintenance of territorial control. The Pennsylvanian Commonwealth of the Quakers was exceptional in that it refused for a time to use external force. Between these two extremes, social action may be oriented to any number of goals, and therefore a community may be robber state, welfare state, constitutional state, or Kulturstaat. Communities united merely for defense may in peacetime relapse into a state of anarchy. In the strict sense, the more consensual recognition among the members of the given economic order. And external peacetime may also be a period of internal war. Thus, the ascendancy of the political community over other groups becomes the history of internal pacification, of the peace edicts of the kings, bishops, and cities during their struggles with the feuding nobility. Old and new groups whose ideal and material interests were not adequately protected by the traditional arrangement demanded pacification and the nationalization of legal norms treated in the sociology of law. Weber clearly distinguishes between patriarchal, non-authoritarian, consensual, and arbitrary power, and political powers proper, autonomous military and judicial authority. The prototype for political power in imperium of the legitimate Roman officials, which later was usurped by military leaders who received ex post facto confirmation by the Senate. Political authority involves the power over life and death, which gives the political community its specific pathos. As the community develops, political coercion frequently becomes internal, since many demands of the political order are accepted by the members of only under pressure. However, a political community is held together not only through coercion but also through community. However, a political community is held together not only through coercion but also through common historical experiences. It is a community of shared memory. Yet both the pathos of the supreme sacrifice and the shared memory of dangers persists also in other groups, ranging from those practicing violence, the camorra, nowadays the mafia, to those suffering it, as in persecuted sects. After an historical sketch of the development of political community, Weber again takes up the European state of affairs on the eve of the First World War, comparing it with capitalism and imperialism of antiquity, the dynamics of international and national stratification in his dual theme, the relations of prestige and power among and within political communities. Here again was an issue previously raised by Sombart. His Socialism and Social Movement in the 19th Century opened the dictum of the Communist Manifesto that the history of all hitherto existing society has been a history of class struggles. Sombart considered this one of the greatest truths of the century, but not the whole truth. For it is incorrect to say that all history of society is merely a history of class struggles. If it be worthwhile at all to subsume world history under one formula, we will have to say that social history has moved between two poles, which I will call the social and international antagonism. We find the same striving for wealth, power, and prestige among communities as among individuals. Today we are at the end of an historical epoch of national exaltation and in the midst of a period of great social cleavage. It seems to me that all the antagonistic viewpoints of the various groups can be reduced to the alternative, national or social. Sombart did not further pursue the topic of international stratification and instead focused on the Marxist concept of class. Weber, however, carried the juxtaposition of the external and internal realm of honor to a logical conclusion and elaborated a scheme that also incorporated the Marxist approach as one segment. In the external sphere, he was concerned with power prestige, not just with national pride, which can also be found in non-expansionist Switzerland or Norway. Since power prestige derives from power over other political communities, it promotes expansionism and is thus a major component cause of war. The prestige pretensions of one country escalate those of others. Weber points to the deteriorating relations between France and Germany in the first decade of the century when, in contrast to the 1890s that Sombart had in mind, nationalist antagonisms prevailed against over internal cleavage. The carriers of power prestige are the great powers, yet their ruling groups, fearing the seizure of power by their own victorious generals, are not always expansionists. Witness ancient Rome and early 19th century England. In both cases, however, capitalist interests enforce the resumption of political expansion. Weber's theory of imperialism adds the economic element to prestige factor. Building on the earlier writings, Weber constructs his notion of imperialist capitalism from the first great historical case, ancient Rome with its tax farmers and state purveyors. In modern times, as in antiquity, it is the general structure of the economy rather than trade interests which is crucial for political expansionism. Imperialist capitalism may be restrained by the profitableness of pacifist capitalism, but for his own time, Weber foresees the former's ascendancy largely because of the state's role as the biggest consumer of the defense contractors and similar enterprises. The economic pacifist interests of the petty bourgeois and proletarian strata are easily reduced by appeals to the emotive idea of the nation. Weber reviews the diverse cultural and social characteristics of individuals that may define membership in a nation. He emphasizes three elements. One, the speed with which certain historical experiences can create the sense of nationhood. Two, the different meanings of terms from one country and one stratum to another. The intellectual's role in fashioning a sense of national identity, his unfinished analysis of intellectuals, those who usurp leadership in a culture, Gemeinschaft, breaks off with a hint at the affinity of cultural prestige and power prestige, but not without the skeptical reminder that art and literature of a specifically German character did not develop in a political center of Germany. Weber's improvement on the Marxian class analysis lies in the detailed typology of the three phenomena of power distribution within the political community: class, status, group, and party. Those powerful in the economic order need have neither political power nor social honor, but they often do have both. Apart from the economic order, the distribution of political power is codetermined by the legal order and the social and status order. Weber proposes to consider classes that are communities as Weber proposes to consider classes not as communities, but as propensities for social action, similar to ethnic groups. Therefore, he speaks of class situation, which is defined by market situation, and has two basic categories: property and lack of property. Property, in turn, differs according to whether it is used for rent income or profit making, although it does make a difference whether communities are based on labor, as in soil-tilling villages, or merely on property, as among cattle breeders. The historical origin of class struggles lies not in the countryside but within the city, in the clash between the creditors and debtors. At a later economic stage, the class struggle was transformed into the struggle on the commodity market. In modern times, it has come to center in wage disparities on the labor communities. The contemporary bitterness of wage earners is primarily directed against the entrepreneurs and managers, who are more visible than the real capitalists, the shareholders and bankers. This opaqueness is only one of the many social and cultural factors that influence the way in which class situation may or may not become the basis for class-oriented or party-oriented action. The major polemical target of this exposition on class and class situation was the kind of pseudoscientific operation with the concept of class and class interest which is so frequent these days, and which has found its most classic expression in the assertion, Behauptung, of a talented author that the individual may be in error about interests, but that the class is infallible. A reference, it seems, to none other than the young George Lukács. As against this class reification by a new breed of Marxian metaphysicians, Weber insisted on his own empirical dialectic of class and status. Status groups are real, if often amorphous. groups limiting the sheer market principle with this opposition of class interests. Positive or negative social honor and the basis is the base. Positive or negative social honor is the basis of status groups. Status differences express themselves in the style of life, a phenomenon extensively treated in the sociology of domination. In the extreme, status differentiation leads to caste formation, a link with the earlier exposition of ethnic and religious groups. Status groups are the bearers of all conventions, a structural explanation for the coercive character of conventions that Weber upheld against Stammler. In sum, classes are part of the economic order, status groups of the social order. Put in another way, classes are rooted in the sphere of production and acquisition, status groups in the realm of consumption. Class interests as well as status interests may be represented by parties. In contrast to groups and status groups, parties are always purpose rational associations, since their goal is the acquisition of power in larger associations. Thus, parties are frequently authoritarian organizations, an issue of paramount concern for the sociology of political parties in modern democracy. However, adequately to understand the structure of parties, one must first examine the larger associations within which they operate. Herewith, Weber has reached the sociology of domination. Parties vary not only according to the class and status structure, but also according to the larger group structure of domination. In line with his comparative interest in earlier studies, Weber now proceeds to a broad typology comprising parties and polities of antiquity as well as the Middle Ages of some non-European areas.